and welcome to this week's YouTube video. Today I'm going to show you the second part of how I painted this dog. So this will be layers 3 and 4 that I'm going to show you. Last week I showed you layers 1 and 2, and also I went over the palette that I used to paint this dog. So I would suggest that you watch that video before this one if you haven't already. So let's get straight into the painting and I'll talk about what I'm doing as I go along. The painting time on this video is about 45 minutes, and I will label on the video when I start each layer. Just so you know, it is quite difficult to talk non-stop for 45 minutes, so there will be instances where I go quiet. This is not an issue with your volume, it is just that I am not talking, but I will try to give you as much information as I can as we go along. I make sure that layers 1 and 2 are completely dry before I start layers 3 and 4, but I will paint 3 and 4 on consecutive days because I want the paint to be wet so that I can push and pull it around. As I'm using thicker paint on layer 3, leaving it overnight, it will not be dry, so I can work on it the next day with the paint still being very pliable. So I would suggest that you always do layers 3 and 4 together on consecutive days to give you the ability to be able to manipulate your wet paint. I am using a very small amount of linseed oil on both layers 3 and 4. It is a very small amount though, just to give the paint a little bit of fluidity. And I don't use it all the time, it just depends on the paint itself. So for example, my Rembrandt paint, which is the ultramarine and also the yellow ochre light, is very buttery and it needs no linseed oil. So when I'm mixing using these colours, I generally don't need to use much linseed oil. My Gamsol paints, on the other hand, are not as buttery, so I may need to use a little bit of linseed oil to make them a bit more pliable. Neither are my Winsor & Newton paints. So you just need to work with the consistency of your paint, and if you feel you need to add a bit of linseed oil for fluidity, then do so. But you don't want it to be too fluid, because you will end up losing control of your painting. It is really very much a matter of what feels comfortable to you. So I would suggest experimenting with the fluidity and see what works for you. I am working from 3 images. I have a black and white image to help me assess my values. I have a colour image that I am looking at from my iPad, but I have also printed the image out. This is because my iPad is backlit, so it can make it very difficult for me to sometimes assess correctly what I'm looking at. I find having a printed out photo helpful to compare the two. Sometimes I will be looking at the photo and sometimes I will be looking at my iPad. It depends which one I feel is clearer for what I am trying to paint. Also, it's interesting to note that the eye struggles to see colour and value at the same time. This is why I also have a black and white version of the image for reference, because it helps me gauge my mixing. Very often my tonal values will be almost identical, but there will be a shift in temperature, so it is helpful to know this from looking at my black and white image. Very often your eyes can play tricks on you, and you think something is darker or lighter than it is, so you end up overcompensating in your painting, and it throws your values out, when really all the issue is that there is a temperature shift, that is cool to warm, but not a value shift. There are lots of temperature shifts in this dog, which is why it is hard to paint. White dogs, in my opinion, are the hardest ones to paint. This is true for any white object. That is because the value range can go from 1 to 10. So you have the widest range of values in that white object. Also, a white object takes on all the colours of its environment. So you have a lot of things that you have to contend with when painting white objects, which is what can make it very hard. Very often, I think when artists sit down to do a painting, there is no plan of action of what to do. It can feel a little bit like wading through quicksand and just hoping that you'll get to the other side. Painting can actually be very methodical, a little bit like following a recipe. It's all in the planning. So for example, before I actually started painting this picture, I worked out exactly what I was going to do with it before I started. I have talked about this in quite a lot of my other videos. Preparation is important, but also understanding what makes a good painting and how you do this is important too. In some of my other videos, I have discussed what the 5 essentials are for a successful painting. So just to recap then, these are drawing, value, edges, colour and temperature. So in your head, you need to separate each one of these elements and break your painting down into these 5 things. So when things start to go wrong, because they always do, it is very rare that I do a painting that I have no issues with at all. I use these 5 essentials as my checklist. So for example, I will look at the painting and I will say to myself, is it the drawing? Is my drawing out? This is where a printed out version of what you are painting is really helpful, because if I stand back and I view them side by side, I can compare my painting to the drawing at the right scale, so I can see much more easily where I am out with my drawing. So if it's not my drawing, then I move on to my values and I say to myself, right, is it my values that are out? So a really simple way to check your values is to take a photograph of your painting, turn it into black and white. I do this in iPhotos, and then compare it to your black and white version. Bear in mind though that the photograph of your painting may come out a little darker than the black and white version of the actual photograph. So what you are looking for is an obvious sense of whether anything is out, and it will be obvious. I usually find that it is either my values or my drawing that is out. Especially if you are painting expressively, the drawing can tend to go a bit wayward if you're not careful. So I would suggest that you keep checking the drawing as you are going along by standing back and doing a direct comparison to your printed out photograph, which needs to be the same size as your canvas to work. This is actually called the sight size method. So after I've looked at my drawing and my value, and if they are both correct, I then look at the other 3. So my edges then. These are really important for setting the mood of a painting. You can really lose edges and it can really add another dimension to your painting. So for example, in this painting, I decided before I started that I wanted to lose the edge right underneath the dog's chin as it transitions into its chest. I then also decided that I wanted to lose the edges around the bottom of his ear, right on the left-hand side at the bottom as you look at the painting. There is a sort of small triangle shape created where you see some of the background. Remember that the camera sharpens every element of this photo. I did not think this little area here was important to interpreting the mood and feel of my final painting. So I chose to keep this area soft with diffused edges. Had I not have done this, I would have had a very awkward small triangle shape of dark value in between where the ear disappeared into the corner and the back of the neck began, distracting your eye to this area. So I had already decided before I started painting that I was going to make these areas soft and lose my edges. I had also decided that the bridge of the nose, where I have my area of lightest value next to an area of darkest value, that this was going to be a hard edge. So when you are assessing whether your edges are correct, It may be that you have hard edges where you need soft edges and soft edges where you need hard edges. If you find that your eye is being distracted to an area where you don't want your viewer to look, very often it will be down to your edges. So if you soften the edges of this area, you will often sort the problem out. A good rule of thumb is to try to mimic how the eye would actually view the object. So the eye has a central point of focus and then everything else begins to blur. So if you try to mimic this in your painting, you should find that it works. Here I want my viewers to focus on the top side of the face and the bridge of the nose. Everything else can sort of fade out and be painted quite softly. This will help to create atmosphere in the painting. Okay, so I've looked at my drawing, my value and my edges, and they are all fine. So the next thing I'm going to ask myself is my colour correct? Colour is hard to replicate. I think you will get a more harmonious painting if you mix from a limited palette. When you use the colour straight out of the tube, it is at its most saturated point. You have to remember that it is very rare that colour is like that in real life. So if you are having an issue with your colour being too saturated and unrealistic, you could try either A, limiting your palette, or B, mixing in the colour opposite into the paint to neutralise the paint from the tube. I appreciate that using a limited palette can be quite difficult and it can be quite daunting trying to mix a lot from not a lot, and it can also be quite time consuming as well. So if you like to have a lot of colour on your palette and mix less from more, another way of neutralising your colours is to take the colour opposite and mix this into the paint. So for example, if you are working with red, you would take green. If you were working with purple, you would take yellow and you would mix a little of the colour opposite into your original colour, and you will notice that the original colour will begin to neutralise. So hopefully then that might fix any issues you may have with the colour. So if it is not the colour that is the issue, it may be the temperature. It may be a cooler colour that you needed rather than a warmer colour. So you have two choices here as to what to do. You can either add black or white, which will lighten or darken, but also take out colour and leave you with more of a neutral, or you can add the colour opposite again. So for example, if you were working with yellows and it was just too warm, if you added a blue-purple to the yellow, this would begin to neutralise it and also cool it down at the same time. So this would then make your yellow much cooler. And I'll get a different temperature depending upon which yellow I use. So cadmium yellow is warmer than yellow ochre light, and I'll get a different outcome if I mix purple into either of these. Okay, so I've described to you the checklist that I'm going through in my head continuously as I'm working my way through this painting. I am continuously standing back and comparing my painting to my original photograph and asking myself if my drawing, my values, my edges, my colour and my temperatures are correct. As I progress through the paint, with each layer, I would expect my 5 essentials to be a little bit more accurate. So it's incremental. I do not expect layer 1 to be as accurate or as near to what I am looking at as layer 3. And I would expect my layer 4 to be even more accurate than my layer 3. By approaching your painting in this way and breaking down each element individually, it helps create a checklist that you can work through methodically and hopefully cut out your failure rate by fixing any issues that may arise as you go along. That is general information of how I approach every single painting that I do, with this mental checklist. No matter what I am painting, this doesn't change. I am consistently checking my 5 essentials to make sure that they are correct. And if they are not correct, if you get into the habit of checking consistently throughout the whole painting, you will be able to pull the painting back quickly if you go wrong. So what do you do then if the painting begins to go a bit wrong? Scrape off all the paint from the area and then do it again. If it's really bad, I would suggest scraping back all of the paint from that day and then using some Gamsol to remove the rest of the residual paint. It will look pretty bad at this point, but you need to make sure that all the Gamsol is removed from the surface of the painting. I would then reapply my paint and make sure that I left the day's work at the same point as when I started. So for example, if I had begun layer 3 and I've had a complete disaster with it and I'd removed all my paint, etc., I would then make sure I left that painting in a good enough state that I replicated what it looked like at the end of layer 2. If I messed up on layer 4, I would remove 2 days worth of paint, repaint my canvas so it was at the same point as I had it on layer 2. I would then begin layers 3 and 4 again. I would always make sure that my layer 2 was dry before I started 3 and 4. I think the temptation is to disregard any painting that has gone significantly wrong. Don't forget that no oil painting is ever lost because you can just paint over it. It will only be lost in your head. Sometimes it takes more than one attempt to get something right, so always be thinking of your painting develop incrementally. Layer 1 will not look as good as layer 2. Layer 2 will not look as good as layer 3. Layer 3 will not look as good as layer 4. And so if you try to always get a bit closer and a little bit better with each layer that you do, it doesn't matter if you mess one up because you just take the paint off and start that layer again. If you try to paint perfection from the offset, you will find it harder to turn a painting around because it will be lost in your head. This is why I like this method of painting, because it can be quite forgiving and allow you room to mess up, which total alla prima doesn't allow you to do. As you progress through layers 3 and 4, your painting should get thicker with paint. Ideally, you want to get it to the point where it is covered in paint. This doesn't mean that you have to cover it all in paint on layer 1. You need to find a good place to stop between your layers 3 and 4. I usually find that my concentration begins to go after about 3 hours, and so I generally tend to stop when I find my concentration beginning to slip. But you might be able to concentrate for much longer, so it's a very personal thing, and you have to find what is right for you. Or I might get to a point where I think that's a good place to stop for the day. It's either one or the other, but usually it's because I've had enough. And then I'll do something else that doesn't require quite as much concentration. So I have levels of concentration that I work at, and this one seems to be the maximum. I like to have half of the day with a lot of concentration and the other half of the day doing art that doesn't require quite as much concentration. Again, that's just a personal preference. We all work differently, but I would definitely recommend stopping at the point you feel like you've had enough, because you can lose a painting very quickly in the space of a couple of minutes. So I always think it's best to stop before you tip over to that point. So my aim over the 2 layers is to get enough paint on my canvas to enable me to be able to push and pull it around. It is once you've got to this point that you will really begin to be able to work that painting. When you get it to this point, you need to choose your brushes very carefully. Remember, different brushes make different marks. You need to think about the sort of marks that you are trying to make. Are you trying to drag wet paint across wet paint? If yes, you would be better off using something like a long-haired comber by Rosemary & Co. These brushes are very good for wet on wet painting, and they allow you to pull and push that paint around. They are great for long hair expressive fur. If, however, you are trying to lay the paint a little bit like a sticker and place it onto the canvas, then you don't want to use a long-haired comber. You would be better with a flat brush or something that will act a little bit more like a soft palette knife. But remember, a flat brush will take paint off if you use it in the wrong way. So you need to think about how you are trying to apply this paint. So be constantly asking yourself, am I trying to drag the paint or am I trying to apply paint? And that should tell you the sort of brush that you need to use. The larger your brush, the more expressive your strokes will be. So I only really want to be going in with my small brushes in my area where I want more detail, because smaller brushes will instantly start tightening up my painting. You want to create as much contrast in your painting between different brush strokes that you can. So you want big brush strokes and you want smaller, more detailed, tighter brush strokes. You also want to create contrast in your paint application because this will create interest in your painting. So for example, you could have areas of heavier paint next to areas with lighter paint. A good rule of thumb is to work with the opacity of your paint. So generally, your lighter colours tend to be more opaque because of the addition of white paint. So you could have your darker areas much thinner in paint than your lighter areas. You might have noticed that my paint application is very light. I add my paint very sparingly and I build up very gradually. This allows me a level of control to the painting. Whether I am using a large brush or a smaller brush for layers 3 and 4, I am applying my paint quite sparingly, continuously. So I might build up one area of painting much more than another area of the painting. This will then give me my contrast of paint because some areas will seem much more worked than others. The paint is not applied all in one go, it is a little by little. I leave my lightest areas until the end. So the really white areas that carry the most white paint, I won't touch these until the very end. This is because they carry the most white paint, and white paint is naturally much more opaque, and so my paint will be thicker in these areas. Too much white paint can result in a painting that is a bit chalky. It is very hard to correct an area where I have added too much white paint. So I suppose out of caution, I leave these areas right until the end. Because I don't tone my canvas too dark and I use a slight wash of raw sienna before I start painting, it makes it easier for me to leave these areas right until the end without it affecting how I view the painting. I also need to make sure that I have a good transition between my whitest area and my darkest area. I don't want to go straight from light to dark, but I need to put in some bridging colour, especially where my temperatures are going from warm to cool. The purple next to the white bridge of the dog's nose is carrying more red and yellow than blue. Put next to the white, which is carrying a trace of yellow and red, gives the effect of a bit of a glow to that nose. If I'd gone straight from my white to a cool purple, it wouldn't have worked. The trace of yellow and red in the white is not enough on its own. There needs to be a bridging colour between the dog's nose and the background, and that bridging colour needs to be warm. Just remember that the nose is in the light and the light is warm. So we really need to emphasise this. Adding a warm bridging colour helps to do this. Making that bridging colour more saturated in colour will further emphasise the warmness of the dog's nose. Because I am using a limited palette and I am restricted to basically 5 colours plus white, it is helping to create a really harmonious painting. Everything is mixed from the same colours, but just different quantities of each. So there is no colour jerking as you look at the picture. So even though, for example, the ear looks more orange, it is mixed from the same red as the background. The warm purples around the light source in the background carry the same yellow as a lot of the warm areas in the dog. The really white areas in the dog are either carrying a trace of warm or a trace of cool. So every area of warm in this painting carries exactly the same yellow and exactly the same red. Every area of cool in this painting carries exactly the same blue and exactly the same white. When you mix less from more colours, it is much harder to get this harmonious colour throughout your paintings. I would say it is really worth persevering with trying to master a limited palette. It will transform your paintings. A good way to practice colour mixing is to take an object and then use your limited palette, i.e. your red, yellow, blue and white, to try to mix the colour of what you see in front of you. This is how I learnt to use my palette. I first limited myself to the Zorn palette, which is ivory black, cadmium red, yellow ochre and white. In this instance, black acts as your blue. I practiced mixing with this palette only before I added the additional colours of cadmium yellow, alizarin crimson and ultramarine deep. You will be able to mix all the colours that you need using just these colours. On the dog's chest, to make this look realistic, I need to shift my temperatures. So for example, my highlights have cadmium yellow mixed into white. I then use paint that carries more of a blue-purple, but it is just a trace right next to this. So the area is constantly shifting between warm and cool, even though the values are very, very similar. Because this area is super soft and I am using my thickest paint, I make sure I am using my Rosemary & Co. long-haired comber, as this enables me to push and pull the cool areas into the warm areas. I do not want any hard edges within that area. I want it all to be soft. And that is it. That is the painting. I'm just going to show you a photo of each layer so you can see clearly layers 3 and 4. I hope you have found this double part series on how to paint this lovely silk and wine hound useful. Please like and subscribe if you can, and check out my website sarahhallidayart.com, where you will find examples of my work and details of online classes that I run. Thank you for watching and see you for the next one.